Hello everybody, today we're going to talk about one of the most important and misunderstood stories in the entirety of the English language, Frankenstein. The original edition of Frankenstein was written by Mary Shelley in 1818. And from there, the story's combination of romantic and gothic themes laid the creation for horror as we know it today. However, while many of you are probably familiar with the concept of Frankenstein's monster and the literal hundreds of adaptations the story's had, a lot of people overlook the depth and impact that the original tale holds. So today, we're going to give the story the justice it deserves and go through the story together and see what made it so special. And it would be amiss to talk about Frankenstein without mentioning some of the adaptations. Depending on how long it takes me to go through the original book, we may be looking at the original 1931 film at the end of this video, unless I end up talking about the plot of a 200-year-old book for longer than like an hour, which is pretty on brand at this point, in which case we'll save the adaptations of Frankenstein for another day. Also, what gave me the idea to do this video is I'm currently working my way through the works of Junji Ito, and he made an adaptation of Frankenstein. And some of his artistic representations of the character are by far my favorite, so when you see black and white terrifying images that look like this, just know that's where they're from. But I'm happy to talk about this story because, in my opinion, it was the groundwork for analyzing the human form and consciousness in science itself as the foundation for future terror. When the book was written, most stories revolved around the idea of the indomitable human spirit, or this idea that humanity can surpass any danger it faces. Whereas Frankenstein, or its original title, Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus, flips the table on this idea, and says that while man is capable of great achievement, they are also capable of great terror. So if that sounds interesting to you, stick around as we break down the story of Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. But before I deliver some more cursed knowledge, let's make sure you're being cursed the right way with today's sponsor, Raycon Earbuds. At half the price of their competitors with the best audio package and quality you can buy, it's no secret as to why Raycon earbuds have over 50,000 5-star reviews. With a design that can amplify your sound while isolating outside noise, as well as an awareness mode that you can toggle if you want to be more aware of your surroundings, Raycon earbuds are not only useful, but they're also very comfortable as you're wearing them. And it's thanks to that design that whenever you're wearing your Raycon earbuds, no matter how you move your head, or what you do, or what activities you're taking part in, your Raycon earbuds will never fall out. I wear my earbuds when I'm hiking, working out, reading a book, or anything in between because they're the perfect earbud for every daily activity. Raycon earbuds offer a 32-hour battery life with 8 hours of playtime. The design of the earbuds also feature a large push button on the side of the earbud itself, so you can use this button to turn up the volume, skip ahead in a song, pause or play your music, and even pick up a call. Because thanks to its design, comfort, and quality, Raycon can make any day better starting today. Because if you go to the link in the description at buyraycon.com/Wendigoon, you will be able to get your Raycon earbuds for 15% off. That is right, 15% off your Raycon purchase. All you have to do is go to the link in the description at buyraycon.com/Wendigoon to save money and get in on this fantastic deal today. Thank you all so much for watching the ad. Thank you so much to Raycon for sponsoring my videos. It really does mean the most. Hope you all check them out. Link is in the description, and we are back to the video. We are going to go ahead and get into it, but as always, thank you for watching. Now, to give some context, the version that I read twice at this point in preparation for this video is the 1831 or second edition of Frankenstein. The original edition was published in 1818 by Mary Shelley. Mary Shelley, for those that don't know, is essentially the proto-goth or the original goth girl, so we all owe her our due respect. But in her adult life, she lived around prominent figures of the writing community. Her husband Percy Shelley was also an author and is most famous for his short poem, Ozymandias, which is famous as it would eventually go on to be the title of a Breaking Bad episode. I'm so sorry. In 1860, Mary had published several poems but had never published an entire novel. That was until one night in 1860 when herself, her husband Percy, and several of their writing friends were all gathered together where they decided it would be a fun game to come up with a ghost story. So that night, all of the writers came up with a short summary of what could make a good ghost story. And the concept that Mary came up with would eventually become Frankenstein. At her husband's insistence, she continued to expand the story till it became the complete novel that we know today. The original edition that was published in 1818 was published anonymously. That is because Mary believed a story that covers disturbing concepts wouldn't do well if the publisher was a woman. However, years later in 1831, Mary would officially publish Frankenstein under her own name, and that's the version that is most often read and remembered. She also made minor changes to the story and specific events and descriptions between the two versions, but I'll mention some of those as I go through the narrative. As I said in the intro, I believe Frankenstein to be one of the most important and inspiring stories in Gothic literature. So with that out of the way, let's go ahead and get into the story itself. The story begins by being told through a series of letters. These letters are from a man named Robert Walden, who is writing home to his sister as he is out on a voyage of the Arctic. Now, parts of the story like this, for the sake of time, I'm going to summarize quickly. There is a lot of depth that can be pulled out in the symbolism and the beauty of the writing itself in these sections of the story. So I highly suggest with all of these stories that you read or listen to Frankenstein yourself, but I'm more interested with the man trying to be God, creating monster beast thing, yada yada. So to summarize, across these few letters, Walden is telling his sister of how he is traveling to the Arctic to try to find out what's at the North Pole, or as he calls it, the thing which moves the needle. See, in 1818, no one had made it to the North Pole, so it was a sort of secret where magnetism comes from, or how compasses work. So Walden's an explorer looking to make the great discovery of whatever's up there. He also remarks to his sister of how he feels alone as he does not have a friend, or someone that he can explain his grandiose ideas of existence and of science and discovery and what have you. Because while he is at sea with several sailors, he desires to find someone of a like mind. These letters continue until Walden says that the sea is beginning to freeze, and because of that, his travel is slowed substantially. And then one day, in the midst of the frozen sea, the crew looks out and sees what appears to be a man on dog sled traveling across the frozen water. This is suspicious for a couple reasons. For one, there's absolutely nothing out here but ice, so it doesn't make sense of where a man would be able to live, especially with dogs and traveling across the ocean. And more bizarre, this figure is at least 8 feet tall by Walden's guess. Which, yes, giants, giant man, go ahead, giants, haha, we're moving on. The next day, after seeing this man on the sled, they see another man on the sled, this time next to the ship. A piece of ice had broken off, and he floated over with a dog sled similar to the past man next to the ship itself. This man, who is now floating next to the ship, was of normal stature and very emaciated and weak. His dog sled had one lone dog, and the man himself seemed to be near death. The men aboard the ship tell the man to come on, and when he doesn't respond, they say that if he doesn't come willingly, that they're going to drag him onto the ship because they're not going to let him die out there. The man simply looks up at them and asks, are they going to the North Pole? When they say yes, he says that he would be happy to travel with them. In his letters, Walden says that this new stranger is very kind and smart. He's not only very knowledgeable in science, but speaks with an earnesty that everyone around him can recognize. Walden is overjoyed, remarking to his sister that this is the friend that he has longed for. Over the next few days, after listening to this stranger's story of the marvels of the natural world, Walden becomes overjoyed and decides to tell the stranger about his own experiences with science and how this expedition is to find whatever's at the North Pole. Upon hearing this, the stranger begins to weep and yell. He remarks that he can't believe he is now dragged back into the same desire that destroyed him. Walden is confused by this. He has no idea what the stranger is talking about, and the stranger seems to flip out just because Walden wants to pursue science. The stranger says that this was once his desire as well, and it led him to the turmoil that he currently lives in. So, in order to warn Walden of what may befall him, he decides to tell Walden his life story. Walden grabs paper and begins to record the stories as the stranger tells them. This narrative, as recorded by Walden, is the primary story of the book itself. So the stranger begins by telling Walden his name, Victor Frankenstein. And in these writings, the story of Frankenstein begins. Victor was born to a wealthy family in Geneva, Switzerland. Throughout Victor's upbringing, all that he ever knew from the Frankenstein family was love and support. He He remarks that the way his father met his mother is that his mother's father had died and she was left homeless, and because his father loved his mother and didn't want to see her go through any other trouble, he married her immediately. He remarks how loving and kind his parents were to him, and that despite his father's riches and all the business ventures he went on, there was no treasure more important to him than his son Victor. This love of his parents extended to others as well. The Frankenstein family was viewed as these noble benefactors who everyone in the community looked up to, and they constantly opened up their home for those who needed it. When Victor was about 5 years old, his parents, who were named Alphonse and Caroline, were traveling through a small village when they found a young orphan girl. The girl was about 5 years old, and it was explained to Alphonse and Caroline that the daughter's parents had died recently. So, seeing that this young girl had nowhere to stay, they invited her into their home. So, this young girl by the name of Elizabeth became a part of the Frankenstein household. And Victor and Elizabeth became close friends, even referring to each other as cousin. Now, remember earlier how I mentioned there were some differences from the 1818 edition and the 1831 edition? This is one of them. In the original 1818 story, Elizabeth is in fact Victor's cousin. Whereas in the 1831 version, as I just mentioned, they just call each other cousin. Later in the story, as you could probably imagine, Elizabeth and Victor form a romantic bond. And while that wasn't out of place in early 1800s European aristocracy, whenever Mary was going to release a version in her own name, she went, nah. And that's actually the biggest change between the two editions. Victor's other close friend, as he was growing up, was named Henry Clerval. Henry of the Clerval family lived close to the Frankenstein estate, and the two were best friends growing up. From a young age, Victor had an intense fascination with the wonders of the natural world. Specifically, those attributes of the natural world which really couldn't be explained. Things like the concepts of life and death, and the sustaining rejuvenation of nature around us. He became intensely focused with ancient concepts like the elixir of life and the philosopher's stone, constantly studying the works of people like Agrippa and other old world alchemists. His father dismissed these at a young age, saying that this is old knowledge that is no longer applicable, and he should just focus on learning the new science, the correct science. Well, whenever a father tells their son to not do something because it's stupid, it just makes the kid do it more. And that's exactly what happened with young Victor. He began to get his hands on any book he could that related to merging of elements, or of creating new materials, or other old world concepts that were considered outdated but held interest to him. He specifically became interested with the concept of necromancy, or raising the ghost, or raising of the dead in old world philosophy. Even now, while relaying this story to Walden, because remember the entire story is Frankenstein narrating his life for Walden in the Arctic expedition, he remarks that he looks on these times with anguish and sadness, because at the time he felt like he could only travel up, but now in the present he recognizes this was the beginning of his fall. He continued to learn on his own until tragically, when Victor was 17 years old, his mother died of fever. Just before her death, whenever the family was gathered around her bedside, among her last words, she asked that Elizabeth and Victor would one day be married. Now, at this point in his writings, Victor had mentioned that he had developed a love for Elizabeth. However, this love for Elizabeth was not as important to him as his love of science. So, with the death of his mother, Victor decides it is now time to put action to his wants and goes off to university. He mentions that he did plan to eventually marry Elizabeth, and he wanted to exhaust this part of his life before he went on to marriage and becoming a father. So, Victor travels to university at Ingolstadt, Germany. While there, he begins to enroll in classes that fascinate him, beginning with natural philosophy. The natural philosophy professor, Mr. Krimp, asks Frankenstein of his previous studies. So Frankenstein answers honestly and says that he studied the alchemist and old philosophers. Mr. Krimp immediately berates him for this, saying that all of that time he spent reading was completely wasted, and gives him a list of books to read so that he can actually learn the right way. Victor remarks at how much he hated this, saying that it seems science has exchanged its ancient hopes of grandeur for modern promises that are lame. Like, Victor's interested in changing elements and raising the dead, and then he goes to university where they can promise the ability to grow plants. Woohoo. That is until he meets a professor by the name of Mr. Walden. Walden begins to encourage Victor's ideas, saying that if it hadn't been for those ancient philosophers and alchemists, science wouldn't be anywhere close to where it is now. Victor remarks on these stories, saying while Walden had good intentions, it set him down a course of misery that he's still living to this day. So with that, Victor sets off, now renewed in his vigor, to discover the secrets of life itself. And to do that, he decides to study death itself. Victor felt that there was some hidden link that the ancient alchemists couldn't find and modern science had overlooked that he could use to make the two draw together. And to do that, he needed to observe death in action, specifically the decomposition of human bodies. So at night, while at university, Victor would sneak out to the cemeteries of Germany and begin to examine bodies as they decompose. He did this for months on end, taking notes at how the bodies form and how pieces fall apart and what decomposition is. And from these studies, Victor said that he had finally done it. He discovered the secrets of life itself. During this part of the story, the narrative breaks as Walden tells us that regardless of how much he pushed Victor, Victor would not give any clue as to what the secrets of life are, because Victor is terrified that someone will eventually recreate his experiments. Victor says that he discovered the secrets and the concepts of becoming a god, and that it's a power no man should hold. And he tells Walden that if he doesn't believe him, just listen to how the rest of the story goes. After discovering whatever this secret to life is, it's not really explained. It's kind of implied to be some sort of chemical process, but there's also mentions of galvanism or early concepts of electricity. Whatever it is, Frankenstein can use it to give life to something. So with this theory in mind, he sets about building an experiment. Night after night, Frankenstein lurches into the cemeteries and begins to scavenge the bodies of the dead. He goes into the mausoleums, the burial chambers, digs some up, and begins to harvest bodies piece by piece. He decides that if this is going to be a grand experiment to bring a new creature to life, then why not go all the way? Instead of just making another man, he's going to make a giant man, one at least 8 feet tall. He begins to take the largest sections of legs and bones that he can find and stitch pieces of torsos together on top of each other to expand them. He decides if he is going to create a new species of creature, why not make it the best? Furthermore, the bigger the pieces, the easier to work on, and the more he can analyze and take notes about exactly what he's doing. So he spends his days studying at university and then at night goes out and begins to cut up pieces of people before bringing them back to his small college dorm and stitching them together. Eventually, he considers this work more important than his schoolwork and begins neglecting his classes and courses. After all, it seems that he's learned more than they could ever teach him. Frankenstein remained in this state for about a year, constantly bringing in new pieces of bodies and then preserving them in such a way to study them and then watch how his experiments would react with the body and how it would affect the whole. He took detailed notes over all of this, thinking himself to be the next great philosopher. As he begins to put pieces of this creature together, he begins to insert whatever this elixir of life is. And after months and months of toiling, in November, something happens. One night while working on the motionless figure, life floods into it, and Victor watches as it opens a single yellow eye. It's in this moment, having finally achieved what he set out to do, that Victor has a moment of clarity. See, before, Victor was entirely obsessed with this concept of being able to raise the dead and create this new breed of creation. However, despite him wanting to climb to the height of God and build angels, he realizes now that what he's birthed is more akin to a devil. He looks across the creature and sees what he's done, for the first time recognizing its stretched leathery skin across its enormous form, causing every muscle and artery to burst out. Its long black hair is matted and lifeless, and its deep black lips show no signs of life, but move regardless. Set within these lips are these perfectly white teeth, which on their own would be beautiful, but set within this uncanny creature creates an abomination. And with all of this being carried by yellow eyes in a massive form, Victor realizes that he has created Frankenstein's monster. Victor goes into a sort of delirium over this, and he rushes to his bed and quickly falls asleep. He had been awake for days working at this point, and it's almost like the creation of the monster itself was a sort of dream that he hoped he could wake up from. While laying in his bed, he has a dream of Elizabeth, and he holds her in his arms, finally recognizing that that was the happiness he should have been chasing. However, in the dream, as he's holding Elizabeth, she slowly transforms into the rotting corpse of his own mother. The rotting carcass that he's holding is more akin to the dream that he decided to chase rather than the one he should have. Victor awakens from this dream in a cold sweat, confused as he's not able to tell what's real anymore. But then reality makes itself known, as through the darkness of the night, Victor peers at the end of his bed, and peeking through the curtains is the smiling dead face of the monster he made. Quickly, Victor jumps out of the bed and runs down the staircase into the courtyard of the dormitory. He spends the night in anxiety, pacing back and forth in the courtyard, waiting for the groundskeeper to come unlock the gate for the morning. Throughout the night, Victor tries to convince himself that the face and the monster he saw in his dorm was a figment of his imagination. As soon as the gates are open in the morning, Victor begins to pace the streets of Ingolstadt. And while pacing the streets and trying to plan his next move, a carriage approaches him. And out of the carriage steps his best friend, Henry Clerval. Henry is delighted to see Victor. For Henry, Victor's been gone for about 2 years at this point. For Victor, Henry couldn't have arrived at a worse time. Despite this, upon immediately seeing Henry, Victor is happy. He says for a moment he completely forgets about the troubles of the night before. Henry sees Victor and remarks on his ghastly appearance. And Victor says it's just college, you know? Henry says he can't wait to see Victor's dorm, and that is when the horror seeps back into Victor's mind. See, the last time that Victor saw the creature was at the foot of his bed in his dorm room. So naturally, Victor would imagine the creature is still in there. So whenever Victor and Henry come to the dorm building, he tells Henry to wait out front while he goes and prepares the room. Victor goes upstairs, opens the door, and the monster is gone. Victor is over the moon about this. The entire day he was trying to convince himself that it was never real, and now it seems that he was right. So he has Henry come upstairs, and Victor just begins laughing and cheering. Henry asks Victor what this is about because this is unusual to say the least. And as Victor is cheering, his mind begins to flood with images of what he made and the terrors that he saw. It's as if spending years in graveyards and hacking up dead bodies never affected him until this moment. See, before, it's as if he was filled with a desire and a passion that made him forget his human apprehension. And now that that desire and passion's gone, all that's left is the terror he's created. So as he's in the dorm with Henry, he begins to imagine the monster appearing in front of him and seizing and grabbing him as Victor begins to scream and fight back against a monster that isn't there. From this, Victor falls asleep for the next couple days, and Henry takes care of him. Whenever Victor awakes, he's experiencing a severe fever, but regardless, Henry is staying by his side. I should mention that the specific setup that Victor had is he had the entry room to his dorm where his bed was, and then there was a second room adjoining it where he did his experiments on the monster. So whenever Victor comes to after waking up, he asks Henry what Henry's been doing, and Henry mentions that he cleaned up that extra room. Henry asked Victor what he could have possibly been doing, as everything in the room was covered in blood and sinew. And Victor's just like, oh, you know, college. See, at this point, Victor is almost in a state of denial about the creature that he's made. And he's certainly not going to tell his best friend about the atrocities that he's done. So Victor just says nebulous things, like he doesn't feel that he should remain in his work or he's gone too far with his studies. And Henry just considers what Victor says to be mad ramblings and stays by his friend's side. During this time, Henry tells Victor that while he's very proud of him and thinks Victor should continue his work, he wishes that he didn't have to, ignore all of his friends and family back home. With that, he gives Victor a letter that was written by Elizabeth for Victor. In her letter, Elizabeth talks of how much she misses Victor and how much his absence has been a weary part of her life. She knows that he's taking part in important studies and doesn't want to slow him down, but remarks that it would be nice if he could write back every now and then. Again, Victor had ignored all of this with his dedication to the monster, or at least the experiment that would eventually become the monster. In her letter, Elizabeth also remarks that a maid by the name of Justine has come to live with them since Victor left, and how she's essentially become the new mother of the household, and everyone loves Justine's presence. With this, Victor becomes renewed and begins to write letters back home, gets back into his college courses, And Waldman, the professor from earlier who managed to encourage Victor along the path of natural philosophy, sees Victor again and remarks how proud he is of how far he's come and how astute of a student Victor is. And all of this hurts Victor inside because while at one time this was what he loved in life more than anything else, simply hearing about chemicals or ideas of alchemy and necromancy now make him physically ill. Henry sees this and begins removing all attributes of science or alchemy or Victor's other previous enjoyments away from the dorm. And Henry begins teaching Victor about the classes he's taking and things like Middle Eastern history and Arabic languages. The unsung hero of this story is Henry. That guy is a great friend at every opportunity. Also, in my crazy haste to jump to people building giant abominations to God, I forgot to mention some story elements. One of those being that Victor has a younger brother. Technically, he has two younger brothers, William and Ernest, but Ernest just kind of disappears from the narrative at some point and doesn't really impact the plot, whereas William, Victor's youngest brother, absolutely impacts the plot. That is because, as Victor and Henry are living together and going about their studies, they receive another letter from Elizabeth. In this letter, Elizabeth informs them that William has been killed. He was only about 6 years old and found strangled to death in a park near the Frankenstein estate. Initially, Victor reads the letter and is immediately overcome with emotion. And the way the story explains what happens next is Henry asks what's wrong, and Victor just hands him the letter, and immediately Henry begins to mourn with Victor. The bond between these two is often overlooked, and one of the things that I feel is most often lost in future adaptations. That and overarching concepts of morality and, meaning, but that's besides the point. So Henry tells Victor that he should go home and be with his family, and Henry will stay here to keep everything in check. So Victor travels by carriage to his home. Keep in mind this journey takes several days. During this time, Victor is thinking of his foolishness to neglect his family, and what kind of monster could have killed a young child. By the time he arrives to his home village, the gates are not yet open as it's too early. So, Victor instead travels to the park where his younger brother was murdered. At the same time this is happening, a storm is brewing. So, as Victor investigates the site of his brother's murder, thunder and rain begin to fall. As Victor is surveying the land and thinking what kind of creature could have done this, he looks up through the rain and darkness and sees the monster staring back at him. The monster has draped itself with a sheet and is watching him from behind the trees. As soon as Victor sees it, it immediately turns around and scampers away up the rock face. Victor is overcome with grief because he realizes that the monster killed William, meaning by effect, Victor killed William. And it's at this point that he realizes the memories that he had repressed and kept hidden away in his mind for over a year now are all real. Understandably troubled by this, he runs home to his family's side. His father, and especially Elizabeth, are thrilled to see him. However, the family has more troubling news. They say that not only has their younger brother William been murdered, but the culprit is the maid Justine. The family is broken by this, and Victor asks what the evidence could be, as Victor knows who the true culprit is. And they said that the pendant of their mother, which William was wearing when he was murdered, was found in the pocket of Justine. Despite these odd circumstances, Victor, having directly viewed the monster, knows that it was the monster's doing. It's no coincidence that the monster he made in Germany would just so happen to be back here in Switzerland at the site of his brother's murder. So Victor declares to everyone that Justine is surely innocent, but he's still too afraid to admit to what he's done, so he doesn't go any further. The family says that they hope he's right and that Justine will be cleared of the charges. At this point, Victor wishes that he could confess, but for one, thinks no one would believe him, and two, fears what would happen to him if they did believe him. So, a trial for Justine is held, and throughout the trial, Justine not only maintains her innocence, but her kindness as well. Several witnesses of character come forward and talk of how sweet of a soul she is. Justine continuously states how much she loved the Frankenstein family and would never do anything to hurt them, especially William, who she practically raised as her own son. However, as mentioned, the evidence is damning, as the only way it seems that pendant could have wound up in her pocket is if she had killed William herself. And whenever asked about the pendant, she simply says she has no idea how it could have gotten in there, but that's the truth. Throughout the trial, Victor is sick, as you could imagine, watching an innocent person go through a tribulation that he created. While in prison, the jailers begin to torment Justine, saying that she'll surely go to hell if she doesn't confess, and that there's no church or no priest that will ever allow her to see the gates if she doesn't admit to what she's done. In fear for her soul, Justine eventually gives a false confession. In her final moments, Elizabeth and Victor go to see her, and she's just as sweet as ever. She tells Elizabeth what an honor it's been to be a part of the Frankenstein family, and further affirms that she hopes Elizabeth and Victor have a happy life together. In her final moments, she wishes ill will on no one, and only says that she is looking forward to being reunited with William. After her execution, Victor changes his mind. He is no longer afraid or in anguish of this creature. Instead, he's ready to fight it. I mean, surely if he created this beast, then he has the ability to destroy it. And Victor is now resolved to lure this thing into the open so that he can end what he started. So Victor travels to France and begins to climb Mount Montevert. He does this because Victor assumes the monster is following him, and perhaps if he can get to a secluded place away from prying eyes, it will finally confront him. And while standing there on the top of the mountain, ready to face off against his creation, the monster appears. I perceived, as the shape came near, sight tremendous and abhorred, that it was the wretch whom I had created. I trembled with rage and horror, resolving to wait his approach and then close with him in mortal combat. He approached, his countenance bespoke and bitter anguish, combined with disdain and malignity, while its unearthly ugliness rendered it almost too horrible for human eyes. But I scarcely observed this. Rage and hatred had at first deprived me of utterance, and I recovered only to overwhelm him with words expressive of furious detestation and contempt. "Devil!" I exclaimed. "Do you dare approach me? And do not you fear the fierce vengeance of my arm wreaked on your miserable head? Begone, vile insect, or rather stay, that I may trample you to dust, and oh, that I could, with the extinction of your miserable existence, restore those victims whom you have so diabolically murdered." Despite the size and scale of this creature, Frankenstein is ready to end his own life if it means the destruction of this monster as well. But to his surprise, the monster does not fight, it does not run, it does not cower. Instead, it speaks. "I expected this reception," said the demon. "All men hate the wretched. How then must I be hated, who am miserable beyond all living things? Yet you, my creator, detest and spurn me, thy creature, to whom thou art bound by ties only dissoluble by the annihilation of one of us. You purpose to kill me? How dare you sport thus with life? Do your duty towards me, and I will do mine towards you and the rest of mankind. If you will comply with my conditions, I will leave them and you at peace. But if you refuse, I will glut the maw of death until it be satiated with the blood of your remaining friends." This is not what anyone was expecting. The monster speaks, and it not only speaks in this garbled, broken tone as we may assume, it speaks with elegance and purpose. In the years since this monster was created, it has adapted itself to potentially the level of mankind. And here it speaks to Frankenstein not only with purpose and not only telling him that he has a duty as the creator to the monster himself, but that if Frankenstein does not uphold this duty, the monster will continue his torment on Frankenstein's remaining friends. Frankenstein responds by trying to punch it. Because, sure, why not? The monster swiftly avoids his attacks and continues speaking. As he speaks, he says that he's suffered enough at the hands of man, and eventually appeals to Frankenstein's pathos as a creator. "Remember that I am thy creature. I ought to be thy Adam, but I am rather the fallen angel, whom thou drivest from joy for no misdeed. Everywhere I see bliss, from which I alone am irrevocably excluded. I was benevolent and good, misery made me a fiend. Make me happy, and I shall again be virtuous." From this, we see that the monster isn't only intelligent, but he's also studied. He refers to himself as Frankenstein's Adam, or more so, he's supposed to be his Adam, but is instead his fallen angel, his Satan. and he simply asks that his creator grant him a request. Eventually, through the monster's conversation, Frankenstein stops trying to punch it, and the monster asks for Frankenstein to join him back at a cave he's been living in so that he can hear the monster's tale. Of course, Frankenstein wants to know how his creature came to be, so he complies. So Frankenstein and the monster set within a cave, and the monster begins to tell Victor of his own story. The monster says that when he was first created, he was essentially an infant. He was able to move and had basic emotions, but no means of higher order thinking. He says he remembers being created on a cold night, before stumbling into the streets and eventually the forest of the town he was created in. All that the monster had with him was a coat he took from the dorm room where he was made. He stumbled about in the woods, experiencing the first sensations of nature, and the monster thought it beautiful. He would listen to the songbirds and the ravens and begin to try to mimic the noises they were making back to them. He would touch water and feel the warmth of the sun and begin to understand sensation. However, he would occasionally come across a person, and every time that he did, they looked on him with terror. They would throw rocks at him, they would yell and curse and try to hit him. The monster understood none of this and began to remove himself more and more from places where people congregate, until eventually, the monster found a cottage alone in the countryside. Next to this cottage was a derelict shack that it seems no one had entered in years. So one night, under the cover of darkness, the monster went into this shack, and it is from there that the majority of his story takes place. The shack had a small hole in the wall that allowed the monster to see into the living room of the cottage, and it is from there that his understanding of humanity began. Inside of this small cottage lives 3 people. Again, at this time, the monster does not understand language or know their names, but he would eventually come to know them as a young boy named Felix, his sister Agatha, and their father, who they simply referred to as Father. Day after day, the monster would watch these 3, and he would begin to try to mimic the noises they made towards each other, like brother and sister. During this time, he also begins to recognize human emotions. The monster itself had felt sadness and joy whenever it saw the wonders of nature or was attacked by townspeople, and he recognizes those same emotions mirrored on the 3 people in the cottage. For example, at one point, the monster eats a lot of their food supplies because he doesn't understand that that's theirs and he's stealing. And whenever the family sees that some of their food is missing, he understands the sadness that comes over them. So the monster tries to help the best he can. He watches the brother, Felix, travel out every day and gather firewood before stacking it next to the house. So, each night the monster goes into the hillside and brings back as much wood as he can and leaves it for the family. He sees during the cold winter that Agatha has trouble walking out of the house whenever it snows, so the monster goes out late at night and clears the snow with his hands. The family is overjoyed by this providence and thinks that God or some angel must be looking out for them. A sad irony given the monster's reputation as a demon. At this point, the monster also didn't understand why he was so hated and despised by man. Until one day, while walking in the woods, he bends down in front of a river and sees his own face. He himself is taken aback by the horror of it, and for the first time he realizes why humanity looks down on him. Again, at this point, the monster doesn't remember anything of his creation or how he came to be like this. He just knows that he doesn't look like everyone else. However, despite this, the monster's most pressing issue is his constant loneliness. He exists next to, but in isolation of humanity, and as something that has emotions and the mind of man, there is no fate more terrible. So the monster becomes determined to learn how to communicate with humanity and learn of humanity itself. He begins to listen intently and try to understand sentence structure as the 3 talk to each other. He picks up on things like their names and what a cottage is, and words like food and fire. However, the monster's true education would come when a new guest arrived at the cottage. One day, a beautiful young woman by the name of Safi showed up at the house. And for the first time, the monster said that he witnessed excitement as the entire family was overjoyed and rushed to her immediately. What the monster didn't realize then, and would realize now recounting the story, is that Safi was Arabic, and more so couldn't speak English and didn't understand European customs. So every day, Felix would sit down with Safi and have lessons on English. And of course, the monster who is behind Safi in the shed of the cottage is also receiving the same lessons. It is here that the monster began to actually properly learn English, and not only learn enough to speak it, but learn enough to contemplate and speak at a higher degree. He learned more details from this. For example, the father of the family, who he now knows to be the DeLacy family, is blind. Felix also teaches Safi of the Bible, and from that the monster hears the entire story of creation, the fall of man, redemption, and the rest of human history. The monster constantly remarks how amazing it is to him that the same humanity who is capable of creating empires and saving millions of lives is also capable of destroying those same lives and wiping out everything that other humans had built. And through stories of humanity, both fictional and historic, the monster begins to understand the wide breadth of humanity itself. However, he remarks how this is all the more tragic because he alone exists outside of that humanity. He knows everything about them. He understands the language, he understands their stories, but he can't interact with it, which is the worst torture of all. As a matter of fact, despite learning all of this from Felix, they are still separated by the wall of the cottage. There's a philosophy that is brought up a lot throughout the story, not only the monster's recounting of his own experience, but in Victor describing his experiments as well. And that is the concept of the base and the reform. And no, not based, although, they're kind of the same thing. Whenever humanity is referred to in its worst parts, it is referred to as its base. You could think of it as primality or savagery, the idea that resorting to violence or these monstrous creations are the base humanity, while the reformed humanity is the humanity of morality and understanding and furthering science. And one of the debates that occurs throughout the narrative, which I'll talk about more at the end, is the concept that perhaps this monster is human, but is more of a base human as he's never had a chance to become a reformed human. Because never having that chance to grow, he exists in a constant primal state of being. However, the other side of this coin is that Victor, looking to excel his own self and then step up to God, is no different than Adam and Eve in the garden, or the Tower of Babel, and other historic examples of basic people trying to rise to a height that they were never meant for. And it is the first concept that we'll see brought up more later of Frankenstein and his monster being more alike than either would care to admit. Also during this time, he learns the story of how the family came to be in this circumstance and who Safi is. And to be honest, it's not entirely relevant for this summary I'm giving, so the short version is that Safi's family, who again is from Arabia, had the DeLacy's, or at least Felix, come live with them for some time, and Safi's father was arrested by the government, and Felix agreed to help him break out of prison if the father agreed to give Safi's hand in marriage. And after he was broken out, the father betrayed Felix and essentially exiled him. So the DeLacy's, or the three DeLacy's, the father, son, and daughter, or the father, Agatha, and Felix, have been living in this cottage for several years since that betrayal, which is why they were so happy when Safi found them one day and showed up and all of this began. It's a very long section in the story, but the main point to get across is it's a practical application of the concepts the monster's been learning. He learns of love and romance, which is, again, a new concept to him, between Safi and Felix. He learns of base humanity, or betrayal, whenever Safi's father went back on his deal with Felix, and he sees sadness and reunion and other human emotions. During this time, while scavenging out in the forest and around the house itself, the monster finds 3 books. These books are Plutarch's The Lives of Ancient Greeks and Romans, Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther, or Werther, I guess, since he was German, and Milton's Paradise Lost, which, through these stories, the monster learns of tragedy and mythology and these great tales of humanity's capability of rising and falling, but the one that he takes the most interest in is Paradise Lost. But Paradise Lost excited different and far deeper emotions. I read it as I had read the other volumes which had fallen into my hands, as a true history. It moved every feeling of wonder and awe that the picture of an omnipotent God warring with his creatures was capable of exciting. I often referred the several situations as their similarities struck me to my own. Like Adam, I was apparently united by no link to any other being in existence, but his state was far different from mine in every other respect. He had come forth from the hands of God, a perfect creature, happy and prosperous, guarded by the special care of his Creator. He was allowed to converse with and acquire knowledge from beings of a superior nature, but I was wretched, helpless, and alone. Many times I considered Satan as the fitter emblem of my condition, for often, like him, when I viewed the bliss of my protectors, the bitter gall of envy rose within me. Which, if you watched my video about Paradise Lost, you could imagine how giddy with excitement I was at hearing this from the monster. While he remarks that he should be like Adam, he feels more akin to Satan, as he feels cast out and despised. The difference between the monster and Satan being the catalyst of their transgression, but we'll talk about that later. But the monster's beginning to develop these ideas of self and begin to ask of his own nature and what he wants. At this point, while considering this in the shed of the cottage, the monster remembered that he has some letters from his creator in the pocket of the coat he took. Remember, on the night of his creation, it was cold, and he instinctually wrapped himself in a coat, and that coat still remains with him. He had found the journal of whoever his creator was sometime before, but he was yet unable to read, and it meant nothing to him. But now, having been taught English by Felix, he is now able to read the journal of Victor Frankenstein. And while reading the journals, the monster begins to despise Frankenstein. The monster remarks, reading Frankenstein's journals, of how this Frankenstein wanted to build something just so he could. Frankenstein in his journal noted the disfigured proportions of it, and how it looked so different from humanity, and how its ghastly form would be given life. And while reading the journal, the monster begins to hate this Frankenstein who he's never met for creating him for no reason more than self-gratification and ignorance. So at this point, the monster's emotions are ready to snap, and he decides that he is going to make his attempt now to connect with humanity before he begins to despise them forever. And he wants to do that by finally speaking to the DeLacy family. So the monster waits until everyone has left the house except for the blind father. So while the father is alone in the living room, the monster steps out of the shed and into the cottage. "I knocked. 'Who is there?' said the old man. 'Come in.' I entered. 'Pardon this intrusion,' said I. 'I am a traveler in want of a little rest. You would greatly oblige me if you would allow me to remain a few minutes before the fire.' 'Enter,' said DeLacy, 'and I will try in what manner I can to relieve your wants. But unfortunately, my children are from home, and as I am blind, I am afraid I shall find it difficult to procure food for you. Do not trouble yourself, my kind host. I have food. It is warmth and rest only that I need.' I sat down and a silence ensued. I knew that every minute was precious to me, yet I remained irresolute in what manner to commence the interview when the old man addressed me. 'By your language, stranger, I suppose you are my countryman. Are you French?' 'No, but I was educated by a French family, and understand that language only. I am now going to claim the protection of some friends whom I sincerely love, and of whose favor I have some hopes.' 'Are they Germans?' 'No, they are French. But let us change the subject. I am an unfortunate and deserted creature. I look around and I have no relation or friend upon earth. These amiable people, to whom I go, have never seen me and know little of me. I am full of fears, for if I fell there, I am an outcast in the world forever.' The two continue to talk as the monster says that he has friends in the region who he hopes will look on him with favor, but he is only known to them as a monster, and they could never see him as a friend. The blind man says that perhaps anyone, if they put away their prejudice, could find a friend where one exists. However, eventually the father asks who this family is, and the monster, unable to contain himself, throws himself at the knees of the father and begins to cry, saying it's his family who he wants to be friends with. The man is confused as the front door swings open and Felix, Agatha, and Safi return home. Upon seeing the 8-foot-tall monster at their father's feet crying in the room, Safi runs away, Agatha passes out, and Felix attacks him. The monster remarks that he could have torn Felix limb from limb, but he was overcome with sadness and misery. So in that moment, he ran from the cottage into the countryside. He had spent over a year listening and living next to these people, but they, never knowing of his existence, were nothing but terrified of him. After a couple days of mulling it over, he thinks, well, maybe if I stand at a distance and begin to talk to them, or maybe if I go up on my hands and knees and offer forgiveness, maybe something can work out. So he makes his way back to the cottage and gets there just in time to see the DeLacys are moving out. And while we can look at this story with tragedy and say, oh, how sorrowful it is they didn't accept him, if you saw an 8-foot-tall giant dead thing next to your blind father in your house, would you be like, oh, well, good thing we have a guest room? It is tragic but understandable from both perspectives. With this, the monster's sorrow turns to fury, as he sees the people who he wanted to treat nicely look on him with hatred. So as soon as the family leaves, the monster burns down the cottage. With this, the final act of removing himself from the experience and dignity of man, now resigned to be their enemy. In the notes that Frankenstein had left in the monster's coat pocket, he had remarked that he was from Geneva. So now the monster was determined to find his creator and either get answers from him or destroy him. So the monster began to make his way towards Geneva. Along the way, he begins to mull over in his mind. Perhaps it's just adults and people who have grown bitter of the world who are terrible and evil. And he decides to put praxis to this concept when, while traveling, he sees a young girl fall into a river and begin to drown. The monster quickly jumps into the river, picks her up, and brings her to shore. And the 5-year-old girl begins screaming and crying, as one could imagine. And her guardian, who was looking for her at the time, sees her being held by a giant 8-foot-tall dead thing, and as one would do, shoots it with a gun. This is the final straw for the monster. He thought, well, maybe children would be more understanding, and he helps a child and is screamed and shot at, so that cut off that line of thought. Finally, the monster continues his travels and makes it to Geneva. While there, he is looking about in the woods for the Frankenstein estate when he comes across a group of kids playing in a park, and you probably know where this goes. The monster initially approaches the young boy and tells him to be quiet as he's looking for someone. The boy, seeing the monster, immediately begins screaming and yelling, and the monster, not wanting to be spotted, quickly grabs the boy and tells him to be quiet. As the monster is holding the boy, he begins to threaten the monster, telling him to let him go because his father, Mr. Frankenstein, is a respected man and will have him punished. And upon hearing the word Frankenstein, the monster's rage overtakes him and he kills the child. Standing over the body, the monster becomes enthralled, saying that he is capable of destruction and he can destroy these creatures who have wanted to destroy him for so long. While looking at the boy, he notices an open pendant on his neck and sees the picture of a lovely woman, the Frankenstein mother as I spoke of earlier. The monster says he's temporarily overcome with her beauty and form and decides to take the pendant from the boy. The monster then leaves and decides to sleep in a barn loft in the next town over. As he begins to lay down, he sees that there's a beautiful young woman sleeping in the loft as well. He looks at her form and her beauty and becomes filled with rage once again as he realizes the beauty and love of a woman is something that he'll never experience. So as yet another act of misanthropy, he takes the pendant of the boy and places it in the pocket of this young woman, hoping that the murder will be on her head and no one will be looking for him. And of course, as we understand, this young woman was Justine. And from there, we pretty much know what happens. Victor came home, Justine was convicted of the murder of William, and Victor went to find the monster, to which he did, and this conversation is taking place. So the monster ends his story on this note. At length I wandered towards these mountains, and have ranged through their immense recesses, consumed by a burning passion which you alone can gratify. We may not part until you have promised to comply with my requisition. I am alone and miserable. Man will not associate with me, but one as deformed and horrible as myself would not deny herself to me. My companion must be of the same species and have the same defects. This being you must create. This monster's one desire is to have a wife, and for Victor to create his Eve. Victor takes a moment to process this and says, no. He admits that he had grown sympathetic of the creature whenever he was talking about his time with the DeLacys, but the mention of the whole murdering Victor's baby brother thing kind of turned him off to the idea. And he remarks that to create 2 of whatever this monster is would be too many, and that the monster himself was a mistake, and 2 wrongs don't make a right, and blah blah blah, I'm not doing it. The monster replies by saying, yes, I am a mistake. I should not exist, but I'm your mistake, and you're going to have to fix it. So you can either try to kill me and see how that goes for you, or make me woman now. The monster even makes a deal with Victor. He says, if you make me a woman, the 2 of us will go deep into the jungles of South America and never interact with humanity again. Or, of course, I could rip you in half if you'd prefer that option. Victor thinks on this, and while he remarks that he didn't necessarily care for his own life, he was pretty over it at that point, he did feel a weird sort of depth to this creature as its creator. So Victor relents and says it'll take time, and he doesn't even know if he can do it again, but if the monster leaves him and his family alone, he will make him a wife. The monster is overjoyed by this, swearing off humanity forever and saying that he will watch Victor from a distance, and that whenever Victor has completed his action of creating another monster, that the monster will come and take her, they will go to the jungle, and humanity will never see them again. Victor still hates the prospect of this, but sees it as the best way out. So Victor travels back to home and begins planning how he's going to build another monster. Whenever he gets there, as you can imagine, the mental toll of all this is weighing him down a lot. And his father sees that something's wrong with his son, so he pulls his son to the side and talks to him and says, look, son, I get it. I know you're going through a lot. You don't have to marry Elizabeth. Because the father sees that as what's weighing on his son's mind, because he knows that Victor has his studies, and maybe he's thinking about what he's going to be doing with a woman or a family in the future. So his father says, while it was the wish of myself and your mother that you 2 would be wed, perhaps you view her as more of a sister. And if there's someone else, I want you to do whatever makes you happy. And Victor, remember, loves Elizabeth a lot. He wants to be with no one else more than Elizabeth. The only reason he hasn't gone through with it yet is, again, becoming a creator, false god, and making a devil thing. And he doesn't want to take that next step until the business with this monster is over. Now, put yourself in Victor's shoes at this point. You have created in negligence this monster that has the capability to destroy a lot of people and a lot of lives. So much so that it has destroyed 2 lives very close to your own. You also have the love of your life waiting back home who you want to marry, but you feel like if you don't take care of this problem right now, it may result in turmoil for both of you. So Victor is determined right now at this moment to deal with the monster before he moves forward with what he wants to do at this point, which is marry Elizabeth. So he tells his father, no, I absolutely want to marry Elizabeth. It's just, I really need to finish my studies. And specifically, I need to travel to England to do that because that's where this school is that I really need to go to. So let me go finish my study stuff and then I'll marry Elizabeth. And the father's like, oh, okay. That was kind of always the plan, but all right. But the father's also worried for Victor's mental health and the fact that the last time he went to college, he didn't talk to any of them for like 2 years. So he tells Victor that that's fine. He will give him his blessing to travel off and go to school and whatnot on 2 conditions. 1, he cannot be gone for longer than a year. And 2, he has to take Henry with him. Now, initially on hearing this, Victor's like, yeah, of course, that's no problem, because he can't wait to see his friend Henry again, because remember, Henry's still at college in Ingolstadt waiting on Victor to come home. However, he then thinks about it and says it's going to be really hard to build a demon wife monster thing out of dead bodies if my best friend's living in a dorm with me. But he figures that's a problem with later, consents to his wishes, says a final goodbye to Elizabeth, and travels off to meet up with Henry. So the 2 join together and they go to England, where while they're in England, Henry is a very big life of the party kind of guy, meeting new professors and talking to other students and pursuing his studies, while Victor's pretty much a recluse and stays in his room all the time. Victor remarks at how much he hates this because he used to be right there with his friend Henry enjoying the social life, but now he has a job to do. So eventually, while the two are staying in Scotland, Victor tells Henry that he has a very important science fair project that he needs to work on, and it's going to take all his time, and he needs dedication to do it. So Henry should wait in Scotland while Victor sails out to the Orkney Islands. Henry's a little confused by this, but Victor assures him, "Don't worry, after I come back from it, everything will be better." And after hearing this, Henry says, "I'd rather be with you in your solitary rambles than with these Scotch people whom I do not know. Hasten then, my dear friend, to return, that I may again feel myself somewhat at home, which I cannot do in your absence." Henry's just like a bro this entire time. He has stuck by Victor's side regardless. He took care of him when he was ill. And I understand that Victor is doing all of this to try to keep his friends and family safe from the monster. But at the same time, there's a bit of selfishness to it because he never tries to explain himself. He never gives a good reason. And it's not so much I feel he thinks people wouldn't believe him, because he doesn't mention that a lot. Victor more so mentions that he's afraid what they'll think of him if he says anything. But I feel that Henry would understand. I mean, the dude was at your bedside for 2 years. If you told him that an experiment went too far, I don't think he'd abandon you. And perhaps if he had told Henry, maybe things could have been different. So Victor sails out to this deserted island and begins to rebuild his laboratory. While there, he is constantly in fear that the monster will appear at any moment. He says he looks out across the stretched plains of the island and keeps imagining, or he doesn't know if it's an imagination or real, of the 8-foot-tall figure just walking over the hillside. And at night, whenever he's in the lab working, he can look up out of the corner into the darkness outside the window and quickly see the yellow eyes move back to cover. He is being driven insane by this and begins to think of all that could go wrong. He has the consideration, what if I create this new monster, and even if the first one wants to go to South America, what if this one doesn't? Or what if the first one's lying to me and it was never his plan to go to South America? And then he has the even more horrible realization, what if these things can reproduce? He says, am I going to be the father of this destruction and breed a, quote, race of devils? Victor has the realization that this is now much bigger than himself and his friends and his family. And while the monster says everything will be okay and peachy if he makes him a wife, Victor realizes he could single-handedly bring about the destruction of humanity. So, while toiling these things over, he's in his laboratory one night and he looks at the window to see the monster smiling, peering at him from around the corner. And in a fit of rage, Victor stands up and begins destroying everything. He destroys the stuff he's working on, he destroys his early specimens, all of it. The monster is infuriated by this and charges inside of the house and begins yelling at Victor. Victor, who is more than over it at this point, tells the monster to go ahead, kill him. It doesn't mean anything more to him because he would rather be dead than make another one of him. The monster continues to yell and shout, saying, "You may be my creator, but I am your master and you will do what I say." Victor again says, "You can kill me if you want, but I'm not making another one of you." Eventually, Victor says, "Devil, cease, and do not poison the air with these sounds of malice. I have declared my resolution to you, and I am no coward to bend beneath words. Leave me, I am inexorable." And the monster replies, "It is well, I go, but remember, I shall be with you on your wedding night." And with that, the monster takes off into the night. The next day, Victor received a letter from Henry saying that essentially he misses him and he hopes Victor comes home soon. So Victor destroys all of his remaining research and then gets on a small boat and begins to travel back to the mainland. During this time, he begins to ponder what the monster told him. "I will be with you on your wedding night." Victor, of course, imagines this means the monster will kill him at the happiest day of his life. And while Victor is continuing to say that he does not care to die, as a matter of fact, he considers himself not worthy of living with all the destruction he's caused, but he says it would be the worst tragedy to leave Elizabeth as a young widow. So he begins to think about ways he could potentially fight back, perhaps guns work on it, or knives. As he's considering his things, he paddles his way back to the mainland, but as soon as he lands on shore, he's seized by a group of townspeople. He asked what the meaning of this is, and they say that he has to go tell his story to the magistrate. Victor's confused by this. He says, "I was on an island doing research for a while, and I just paddled back. What's the deal?" The townspeople tell him that there was a murder the night before and that the witnesses saw someone paddling in a rowboat. So Victor being the only person paddling in a rowboat, they naturally take him to the court. So Victor comes to the court, tells his story, and they say, well, let's show him the body to see if he has any reaction to it, if he really is the killer. And whenever they bring out the body of the murder victim and uncover it before Victor, it is the strangled body of Henry Clerval. It seems that Henry had come to the edge of the mainland to wait for Victor's return, but the monster got to him first. Victor is destroyed. He immediately begins to break down and throw himself on the body of Henry. He is arrested not because the people think that he's the killer, but they think that he's gone mad. And for 2 months, Victor remains in a jail cell in Scotland, wailing and crying through the night of how he caused the death of his best friend. Victor speaks of how time didn't feel real during this stretch in jail, and how he caused the death of the only person who remained by his side through everything. After 2 months, eventually Victor's father gets word of this and comes to get his son out of jail. On the journey back to Geneva, Victor is still beside himself and occasionally says things to his father, like, "It was me, I murdered William and Justine and Henry." And his father is miserable, thinking that his son has either lost his mind or is so overcome with grief that he's speaking nonsense. Which, in a manner of speaking, both are correct. While staying in an inn during their travels, Victor receives a letter from Elizabeth. In the letter, Elizabeth says that while she still wants to marry Victor and nothing would make her happier, that she wouldn't want marriage if Victor himself was not happy with it. And she says that she understands if Victor found another woman, and that nothing would make her happier than Victor being happy. So if he wants to be with her, to not let Elizabeth stand in the way. Elizabeth is a very sweet and understanding soul throughout the entire story. Throughout all of the tragedy that Victor goes through, Elizabeth is by his side. And even now, in this completely destitute place, she is affirming to Victor to not let herself be any more of a burden. But as we know, Victor still loves Elizabeth and wants to be by her side. So he tells his father, whenever they return, they will be married in 10 days. For the first time here, Victor is resolved to live. He wants to be with Elizabeth, and that's what he wants his life to become, in spite of the tragedy that's already happened. So he decides might as well get it over with, and prepares for his wedding, but also prepares for a fight. He begins to load up on guns and knives, and keeps them under his coat at all times. He understands that the monster will come for him on his wedding night, so he decides do that quickly, because he's either going to die, or he can start his life with Elizabeth sooner. So Victor returns, and 10 days later, the two were married. With his new wife, they traveled to the vacation home on Lake Como, Italy. This is not only a romantic and secluded place for a honeymoon, but Victor also feels that he can best defend himself from the monster from that position. They get to the house, and Elizabeth sees that something is clearly wrong with Victor. He's pacing the hallways of the house, checking all the rooms as he has a hand tucked under his jacket, grabbing a pistol. Elizabeth asks Victor what's wrong, and Victor, not wanting her to be hurt or witness the fight that will surely ensue, tells her to go to bed, and that he will be there with her shortly. So Elizabeth says she's looking forward to seeing him, and he better not take long, as she goes to the bedroom. An hour creeps by as Victor paces the hallways, ready to fight whatever jumps out at him. Until the real tragedy of the monster makes itself known, when, as Victor is pacing the hallways, he hears Elizabeth scream, and he realizes that when the monster said he would be with him on his wedding night, it was not to kill Victor, but to make him more miserable. He runs into the bedroom and throws the door open to see Elizabeth lying on the bed. He quickly runs to her side, but whenever he grabs her, he finds that she's already dead. And as he lay there mourning in the wedding bed, Victor sees that the monster has killed his wife. At the same time, he looks to the window, wide open, as the monster stands there, laughing at him, watching him hold Elizabeth's body. Victor quickly pulls his guns and begins to shoot at the monster, and as he does, the monster leaps down and runs into the wilderness. Remember that thing I mentioned earlier, how the line between the monster and Victor becomes more and more blurred as the story goes on? Well, that's what the monster wanted all along. He never wanted to kill Victor and make his suffering come to an end. You could argue that's what the monster may have wanted for himself throughout the story, but he wanted Victor to experience the same isolation that Victor has made him experience. He is condemning his creator and killing his God, not by ending his life, but by dragging his life down to the level that he created. And one of the reasons that I like the comparison to Paradise Lost, which the monster draws between himself and Adam and Satan throughout the story, Satan from the story of Paradise Lost is an apt comparison. Because Satan in that story despised God and hated the author of his creation. So instead, he decides to take his anger out on others by condemning Adam and humanity to the same sin that Satan experiences. And in this story, the monster who despises his creator decides to take his anger out on everyone else to try to make his creator feel the same way he does. And why he considers what Frankenstein did in creating him as an act of self-gratification and envy, the monster is now no better. Because all the monster has done is carry out acts of hatred and evil on others in order to get back at what he feels he is owed. As mentioned earlier, the primary difference between Satan and the monster is the monster's misery began with others' treatment of him, whereas Satan's misery began with his treatment towards others. But regardless of where they came from, they are both now in the same position of doing wicked and considering it retribution. I remember when I was in high school, which was the first time I read this book, it was in my senior English class. And after we had read it, my teacher, Mr. Thomas, was giving us some ideas and theories about themes within the book and interpretations of the Frankenstein story throughout history and media and what have you. And as a lot of you probably know, it is a common mistake that people refer to the monster in the story as Frankenstein. If you go up to a lot of people and ask who's Frankenstein, they'll say, oh, the big scary monster, when in actuality, Frankenstein was the creator and the monster is just called the monster. That's why the correct title is Frankenstein's Monster. And I remember Mr. Thomas was teaching us about interpretations from media and how we can pull more out of a story if we look into deeper themes and what have you, and stuff that I kind of got but didn't really think about at the time because, dumb high school kid. And he was talking about the difference between understanding knowledge of a story or just understanding the dates, characters, and what have you, and wisdom within a story, being able to understand the deeper meaning or what's happening behind the scenes. And then he said, when it comes to this story, knowledge is understanding that Frankenstein wasn't the monster, but wisdom is understanding that Frankenstein was the monster. Because Frankenstein was the one who created the monster, and everything the monster did was a result of his creation. So to a degree, yes, it is wise to consider Frankenstein to be the monster within the story. However, after reading it now, I feel that both Frankenstein and the monster are both the monster. Frankenstein had negligence, and he wanted to rise to the point of God, and he was destroyed for it. The original title of this story, as I said, is Frankenstein or the Modern Prometheus. Frankenstein himself is Prometheus. As many of you know from Greek mythology, Prometheus was the titan who stole fire from the gods and delivered it to man. A gift that was beyond humanity's capability and would lead to suffering and benefit. But Prometheus paid dearly and was punished by the gods for this thievery. So with the title of the book, Shelley is getting across her thesis of the story. Frankenstein is Prometheus. He is taking a gift or some deeper creation that we don't have the power or the facility to understand or create, and he's thrusting it upon us. For that reason, yes, Frankenstein is the monster, because it's through his negligence that all this came to be. And while yes, certainly Frankenstein is a monster of pride and his own grandeur, the monster is a monster of envy. While we can sympathize with his beginning and understand where he's coming from, these cannot excuse the actions of the murder of William or Justine or Henry or Elizabeth. Because everything that he's doing is to try to drag a member of humanity down to his level. Because his innocence has long passed. And while people once falsely accused him of being a demon, he has certainly earned that title now. Both Frankenstein and the monster are the villains of this story. And that's one of the reasons that I find the misconception of Frankenstein and the monster being one to be poetically ironic. Because future adaptations would throw out the concept of Frankenstein's monster entirely. Movies like The Bride of Frankenstein are literally just calling the monster Frankenstein. And a lot of people don't even know that there is a doctor. They just think the monster is called Frankenstein. And if you view the characters of this original narrative as kind of these ethereal entities that have reputation throughout history, it's a sort of justice. The monster will never exist without the shadow and name of his creator lording over him. And the creator will never exist without the image and iconography of the monster. The two are forever bound and intertwined to each other, as in this original narrative, they both drug each other to their level. Frankenstein by his creation of the monster, and the monster by his resolution to destroy his creator. And while Frankenstein and the monster, objectively, through knowledge, are two different entities, there's a piece about them forever being one. Alright, that was enough pseudo-intellectual ranting. Let's get back to the crazy murder monster story. Victor travels home to his father, and upon telling his father of what happened to Elizabeth, his father is overcome with emotion and passes out, only to die a few days later. And now Victor has lost everyone. He's lost his mother, he's lost his youngest brother, he's lost Henry, he's lost Elizabeth, and now he's lost his father. His brother Ernest also kind of just disappears from the narrative, but that's okay. Pretend like he died too. And for several months, Victor doesn't know what to do until he finally decides he should tell someone. Again, something he should have done when Elizabeth and Henry and even William were still alive, but it seems it's too late for now. As when he goes to his magistrate and confesses everything of building the monster and the unrightful execution of Justine and the murder of Henry, the magistrate, as you could imagine, doesn't believe him. Remarking that even if he did believe everything, there's not really a lot he could do for a giant 8-foot-tall giant demon thing in the countryside. If there ever was a time for Victor to confess, it's too late now. And as the magistrate tells Victor that he can't do anything about it, Victor says, "Man," I cried, "how ignorant art thou in thy pride and wisdom! Cease, you know not what it is you say." Who does that sound like? Now Victor's just outright accusing him and calling him a man and prideful. If this was the monster talking to Victor, it wouldn't seem out of place. Again, we see through the dialogue the effects and final product of the monster dragging Victor to his own level. So not knowing what else to do, Victor goes to the graveside of his family, and he sits there in mourning. When while mourning, he hears laughter, and looks up to see the monster standing there, mocking him. In rage, Victor begins to chase the monster, and the monster begins to run off. And for the next several months, while on foot, Victor chases the monster. They go through mountains, cities, and deserts. All the while, anytime Victor is falling too far behind to catch up to the monster would leave behind a clue, like a torn remnant of clothes or a sign to point Victor in the right direction. Victor understands that the monster's messing with him and wants him to continue the chase, but Victor has no purpose left in life than to chase this beast. And it seems that perhaps the monster has no purpose than to be chased by Victor. And any time that Victor is near starvation or the point of death, food or water would appear, the monster literally taking care of him so that they can continue this game. The two continue this chase until eventually they end up on dog sleds treading across the Arctic, which leads us to the position they're in now, with Frankenstein aboard Walton's ship talking of the monster who he was chasing days prior. And with that, Frankenstein rounds out his story and his telling of why Walton should be weary of chasing things he doesn't understand. At the end of his story, Frankenstein begins to beg Walton. He says, "If anything happens to me, you have to carry out this vengeance. Hunt the monster at all costs." We then transition back to Walton's letters sent to his sister. In the letters, Walton says that he believes Frankenstein's story, as Frankenstein spoke with a fervorance, and he himself had seen the 8-foot-tall man on the sled, so it seemed to be the only way this all made sense. He writes to his sister that despite believing Frankenstein, he doesn't think the expedition can continue. Again, remember, the ship's becoming frozen in the water, and they're essentially stranded out there. The crew of the ship say that they want to turn around and head back home, but Walton still wants to carry out his studies, although a bit more hesitant given Frankenstein's tale. Walton tells Victor this and says that the men want to turn around as soon as the ship is freed, so Victor speaks to the men. He gives this rallying speech where he says, what are they going to be remembered as? The men who went home because they were scared, or the men who made history? And how they have to continue to press forward if they ever want to call themselves true men of science and adventure again. Now, this is in stark contrast to what Frankenstein has said previously, whenever he told Walden not to chase his ambitions. That is because Victor is not speaking to these men because he wants them to carry out Walden's journey. It's because he wants to keep chasing the monster. And despite everything that's happened, to some degree, Victor is still that agent of pride. Yes, your journeys and your experiences are not just of your own condemnation, but mine is righteous and must be continued. I must chase this monster until I and anyone else who gets in the way are dead, even if it means risking an entire crew in the Arctic to do so. Walden, realizing his discovery is not worth the lives of the crew, decides to turn around. Victor says that he understands, but as soon as he gets to feeling better, he will continue his travel across the ice. Walden says that he wishes he would remain, but Victor says he has nothing left in life than to chase this monster, and to eventually be reunited with Elizabeth and Henry. That night, after the ship begins to travel home, Victor dies in his sleep. As Walden is writing this letter to tell his sister of Frankenstein's death, he hears something come from the room where Frankenstein's body lay. Walden steps into the room and sees the monster crying over the body of Frankenstein. When the two see each other, they are surprised and taken back, and in a moment, Walden realizes this is the monster Frankenstein spoke of. The monster explains that he's in misery and anguish because after Frankenstein had decided he was not going to create another one like him, the monster decided to make Frankenstein like him, to remove him from outside contact and damn him to the isolation that the monster existed in. And now here, he sees Frankenstein and considers him his last victim, as the monster understands it was his actions that led to the death of Frankenstein, but he no longer has a purpose in living. Walden, who had just heard stories of this guy killing wives and friends and children, isn't really in a, debating mood with the monster and calls him a devil and monster. The monster begins to defend himself, saying he wasn't always like this. It was humanity who cursed him and spit on him and made him become this awful thing. He remarked and said, surely if Frankenstein told you the story of me, then you've also heard the story of Felix and the man whose daughter I saved who shot at me. Are those men not villains? Are they not responsible for my creation, just as Frankenstein is responsible for mine? The monster tells Walden that he himself has an understanding of human emotions and respects, and if there's anyone who hates the monster's form the most, it's the monster himself. And he says that now, since his creator is dead and his torment cannot continue, that the monster is truly once again alone, and he has no further reason to exist, so he will simply end his own existence. He believes fire can do the trick, as fire has hurt him in the past, and he will construct a funeral pyre and cast himself on it. And with that, the novel ends with these lines from the monster. Farewell, I leave you, and in you the last of humankind whom these eyes will ever behold. Farewell, Frankenstein. If thou wert yet alive and yet cherished a desire of revenge against me, it would be better satiated in my life than in my destruction. But it was not so. Thou didst seek my extinction, that I might not cause greater wretchedness, and if yet, in some mode unknown to me, thou hast not ceased to think and feel, thou wouldst not desire against me a vengeance greater than that which I feel. Blasted as thou wert, my agony was still superior to thine, for the bitter sting of remorse will not cease to rankle in my wounds until death shall close them forever. The monster says that Frankenstein has won. There is no misery that Frankenstein could ever give the monster more than what the monster feels right now. Finally, the monster says, "But soon," he cried with sad and solemn enthusiasm, "I shall die, and what I now feel be no longer felt. Soon these burning miseries will be extinct. I shall ascend my funeral pile triumphantly and exult in the agony of the torturing flames. The light of that conflagration will fade away. My ashes will be swept into the sea by the winds. My spirit will sleep in peace. Or if it thinks, it will not surely think thus. Farewell." He sprang from the cabin window as he said this. Upon the ice raft which lay close to the vessel, he was soon borne away by the waves and lost in darkness and distance. And with that, the story of Frankenstein, or the modern Prometheus, comes to an end. With those final lines, the monster gives himself over to despair, which is the final reason I find the Paradise Lost comparison to be so useful. At the end of Paradise Lost, whenever Adam talks to Eve and has the realization that they can be greater than what Satan dragged them down to, because while Satan contains despair, they contain hope. And in this final scene of the story, we see that with the monster wanting to end it all, he is giving himself over to the final act of despair. And with that, he seals his fate as the Satan rather than the Adam of this story. He considers himself less than man and other creation around him, decides to drag his creator down to his level, and in the final moments of the story, throws it all away. While Frankenstein was his creator, he was certainly an imperfect creator, given over to feelings of pride and envy like that of Adam and Eve. And the monster, a form of creation who wanted others to suffer just as he had, is no better than Satan. And that's why, in my opinion, the novel Frankenstein is of a false god and a false devil who are both monsters in their own right. So, pretty cool book. Nah, I love Frankenstein a lot. I hate that the story is, well, I guess a lot of stories are, but this is just an example of something that's so watered down historically that eventually just becomes monster bad, monster kill people, the end. And I think it is phenomenal that Mary Shelley managed to make this story at a time when the majority of literature was dedicated towards ideas of propping humanity up and facing them against absolute evils like demons and the devil. And in this story, Mary managed to combine both concepts in a way that they're kind of mirrors of each other. And this isn't me like pulling all this pseudo intellectual stuff. I mean, maybe a little bit, but the majority of it isn't me just making stuff up to fit this greater idea of a story. These are ideas and concepts she directly referenced in the writing. And it's because of the story's contemplation of humanity, of life, of what evil is and what justice is in the face of evil, and if something that commits evil deserves it, or if it's a product of its environment, or what have you, that I feel Frankenstein is one of the greatest horror novels ever written. And hopefully, if you stuck around this long, you at least think it's kind of neat. But either way, you're still here and you're still watching, and I just want to say thank you for watching. At the beginning of this video, I said that my plan was to cover the adaptations of the story as well, which is true, as I took a bunch of notes on adaptations of the story and like the 1931 movie. But I've now been recording for, I think, 4.5 hours. So yeah, I definitely did the me thing again, where I went way too far and way too hard with it for too long. So I think this video will serve well as just an analysis of the original story. And hey, we're getting into Halloween. I could do a larger video, if you all are interested, of course, looking at the movies and the other books and adaptations of Frankenstein to see what works, what doesn't, what actually adds stuff to the story. I think that would be interesting, because believe it or not, I do like the 1931 version for reasons unrelated or unexpected to the original novel. And I like other like book adaptations as well. The Junji Ito version, which I read, which gave me the idea to do this video, because I'd already read Frankenstein previously and knew I liked it, but that gave me the inspiration to reread it and then make this. I like the Junji Ito version a lot. It changes some details of the story, especially near the ending. But honestly, if you don't want to read through the entire original novel and just want to check out Ito's version, you'll get the main concepts with a lot of really cool visuals. But that can be for another time. If you all are interested in that, check it out. I also don't mean to be doing stories that keep referencing previous stuff I've done. Like, I didn't mean to make a video about a book that relies so heavily on Paradise Lost imagery. That was just a happy accident that I'm happy to accept. But no, I love Frankenstein. I love Paradise Lost. I think they're both fantastic stories, and I like how they kind of had this duality with each other. And I didn't mention all the places where it's brought up, but there's several times, both in Victor's own monologue or self-thoughts, thinking, that's the word, self-thoughts, in Victor's own thoughts, whenever he is considering himself, am I more Adam, and am I more God? And the monster constantly mentions how he turned from Adam into Satan. Because he read Paradise Lost whenever he was in the DeLacy cottage. But yeah, I really like this story, as you can obviously tell, considering the timestamp and me talking about it this long. And I think it's fantastic, and more people should check it out. So hopefully if you watch this, you enjoyed it, you check it out, you read the book that I just spoiled everything for, but it's been out for 200 years at this point, so grow up. No, but for real, thank you all so much for being here. It means a lot. I can't say this enough. Thank you guys for funding the Kickstarter for the Stalker film. We're currently working our way through casting right now, and have seen a lot of good auditions from a lot of very talented actors who have like worked on some really big projects before. And I'm surprised that people who are like legitimately in the industry would be interested in this little project of mine, and that means a lot. But yeah, or of ours. It's not just mine, but it feels it's just wild that I can be associated with something that people who actually know what they're doing are associated with. It's so cool. Anyway, thank you all so much for that. It means the world, and I'm excited to get more details out as they become available, and there's a lot of cool developments happening behind the scenes, and I can't wait to show you all. But thank you for funding it. Thank you so much for subscribing to the channel. We're at 1.81 million. We are within 200,000 subs of 2 million. For those that know, I started YouTube coming up on 2 years ago at this point, and to be near 2 million subs in that time frame is incredible, and you all are a blessing in ways I can't really describe. So thank you so much for that. Thank you all for watching. I've been talking for a long time. I need to get to editing this. I have some cool, well, I think they're cool. I have some horror ideas coming up in the near future for future videos, like around the whole Halloween spooky time. And some of them are a bit more unique. I think you'll like them, or I hope. We'll see what happens. But hopefully you enjoyed this one as well, as I did. And again, I'm so glad you're here. But I believe that should do it for now. So I just want to say thank you for watching. I hope that you enjoyed, and I will see you in the next one. Bye.